Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history from the backwoods of Bourbon County, Kentucky. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We are interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The year was 1889, and Mill Brook, Kentucky, was little more than a collection of farmhouses scattered along the winding dirt roads of eastern Bourbon County. The land was fertile there, a patchwork of tobacco fields, pastures, and dense oak forests that separated one homestead from another. It was the kind of place where neighbors were both essential for survival and yet comfortably distant, within shouting range during emergency, but far enough away to let a family keep its secrets. And no home in Millbrook harbored darker secrets than the weathered two-story house belonging to the Hargrove family. Standing alone at the end of a long dirt road that snaked through a corridor of ancient oaks, the house had been built some time after the Civil War, probably around 1872, when Nathaniel Hargrove returned from fighting with a new bride and ambitions to build a legacy in tobacco. The house itself wasn't particularly remarkable, a plain farmhouse with a central passage design common to the region, 4 rooms downstairs, 4 upstairs, a detached kitchen to reduce fire risk, and a broad front porch where one might take evening air during the oppressively humid Kentucky summers. What made the Hargrove house different was what locals called the feeling. Anyone who visited described a weight that settled over them upon crossing the threshold, a heaviness in the air that made it difficult to draw a full breath. Most attributed this to poor ventilation or dampness that seeped up from the cellar after heavy rains. But the postmaster, Conrad Willoughby, who delivered mail to the remote farms twice weekly, had once described it differently. "That house," he was reported to have said over whiskey at the general store in nearby Paris, "doesn't want people inside it." And the house had good reason to repel visitors, for its mistress was dead, and under circumstances that had set tongues wagging throughout Bourbon County and beyond. Johanna Lee Hargrove was not originally from Kentucky. She had arrived in Millbrook in 1870 as Nathaniel's bride, a striking woman with copper-red hair and unusual amber eyes that seemed to change color depending on her mood. Her background was somewhat mysterious. Nathaniel claimed she was from a good family in Virginia, but she spoke with a faint accent that some thought had hints of something foreign. More curious still was her education. Johanna could read and write, not just in English, but in French and Latin as well, unusual accomplishments for a farmer's wife. This unusual education became a point of fascination and suspicion among the local women, who would often trade stories about Johanna's strange ways. Martha Whitaker, the minister's wife, once remarked that she had seen Johanna reading a book bound in dark leather with no title on its spine. When Martha inquired about it, Johanna had snapped the book shut and slipped it beneath a cushion, saying only that it was family knowledge, not meant for outside eyes. Others noted Johanna's peculiar knowledge of plants. Unlike the other farm wives who maintained kitchen gardens of familiar herbs and vegetables, Johanna cultivated plants that many locals couldn't identify, specimens with odd-colored blooms that opened only at night, and roots that, when dried and ground, emitted scents that lingered in clothing for days. She claimed these were old remedies from her grandmother, brought from the old country, though she never specified which country that might be. For the first decade of their marriage, the Hargroves were regarded as prosperous but private. Nathaniel worked the tobacco fields with a small crew of hired men, and Johanna kept to herself, rarely venturing into Paris for supplies and never attending church services. They had no children, which sparked whispers among the townspeople. The couple's childless status became a subject of speculation, some suggesting that Johanna might be barren, others whispering that perhaps there was something unnatural about their union that prevented offspring. When questioned directly about their lack of children by the more forward ladies of the parish during a rare social appearance, Johanna reportedly smiled a tight, closed-mouth smile and said, "Not all beds are meant for breeding." The comment caused such discomfort that the topic was dropped immediately, though it fueled speculation for months afterward. By 1889, when our story truly begins, Nathaniel was 45 and Johanna 39, still handsome people, but weathered by years of farm life and increasingly marked by a strain that visitors couldn't help but notice. The tobacco farm was prosperous enough, but Nathaniel had developed a reputation for being both a hard drinker and a hard man. The hired hands told stories of his temper, and more than once, Johanna had been spotted in Paris with bruises she attempted to conceal beneath high collars and long sleeves. The dynamics of the Hargrove marriage fascinated locals even before the tragedy. Abigail Cooper, who occasionally helped with laundry at the Hargrove house, reported an odd interaction she had witnessed in the winter of 1888. According to Cooper's account, recorded years later by a local historian, she had arrived early one morning to find Nathaniel and Johanna standing rigid in the kitchen, facing each other in absolute silence, neither blinking nor moving, as if locked in some contest invisible to outside eyes. "They didn't even notice me come in," Cooper recounted. "They just stood there staring, like two statues. There was something on the floor between them, looked like insects, a whole mess of them, crushed. I cleared my throat, and they both turned to look at me at the exact same moment with the same expression. I nearly dropped dead from fright." Then Nathaniel smiled, but it wasn't really a smile if you understand my meaning, and he said, "Mrs. Cooper has arrived, my dear. We'll continue our discussion later." And Johanna, she just nodded and swept up those dead bugs without a word. Cooper admitted that she considered not returning to the Hargrove house after this incident, but needed the wages too desperately to refuse the work. However, she made sure never to arrive before full daylight again. But it wasn't Nathaniel's temper or the strange dynamics of the marriage that locals remembered when questioned about what happened that spring of 1889. It was the bed, the massive walnut four-poster that dominated the master bedroom on the second floor of the Hargrove house. The bed had been a wedding gift from Nathaniel's family. Crafted by a skilled carpenter in Lexington, it featured intricate carvings of tobacco leaves along the posts and headboard. It was an impressive piece by any standard, and in a region where most furniture was simple and functional, the Hargrove bed was something of a local landmark. "That grand bed," said Millicent Thompson, wife of the store owner in Paris, "was about the only thing worth seeing in that dreary house." According to Cooper, who was responsible for changing the bed linens, the Hargroves had an unusual sleeping arrangement. Despite the bed's ample size, they maintained a clear division down the center, with separate sheets and blankets for each side. More peculiar still was the line of salt that Johanna apparently sprinkled down the middle of the mattress each evening, a folk practice that Cooper had never encountered before and could not explain. When I asked about it, Cooper later reported, "Mrs. Hargrove just said it was to keep the night separated, whatever that might mean. Mr. Hargrove caught her doing it once while I was there, and the look that passed between them was cold enough to freeze a well." What happened in that bed on the night of April 16, 1889, became the subject of whispered conversations and increasingly elaborate speculation that continues to this day. The facts, as best as can be established, are these. At approximately 2 in the morning, Nathaniel Hargrove awakened the nearest neighbor, Ezekiel Preston, by pounding frantically on his door. According to Preston's statement to the county sheriff, Nathaniel was in a state of extreme agitation, clad only in his nightshirt despite the spring chill, his face and hands covered in what appeared to be blood. "She's gone," Nathaniel reportedly said. "Johanna's gone, and there's something wrong with the bed." Preston, a level-headed farmer with a reputation for practicality, immediately sent his eldest son to fetch the doctor from Paris, while he himself accompanied Nathaniel back to the Hargrove house. What he found there would haunt him for the rest of his days. Johanna Hargrove lay sprawled across the walnut bed, her nightgown soaked crimson. The bed-sheets, Preston noted with particular horror, seemed to be moving slightly, as if alive with countless small movements. Upon closer inspection, and here Preston's account becomes notably clinical, as if detachment was the only way to describe what he witnessed, he realized that the mattress was infested with insects, not just ordinary insects, but hundreds, perhaps thousands of what appeared to be burrowing beetles that had somehow infiltrated the bedding. They were in her, too, Preston told the sheriff, his voice hollow, in places no living thing should be. In his official statement, Preston described the scene in greater detail, though parts of this statement were later redacted from public records. The unredacted portions include observations that the insects seemed to be moving with unusual coordination, like soldiers following orders, and that they appeared to be carrying small particles of what looked like human tissue from Johanna's body into the wooden frame of the bed itself. It was as if, Preston stated, they were harvesting her. Dr. Vernon Caldwell arrived an hour later and immediately declared Johanna dead, though determining the cause proved more complex. The most obvious explanation, blood loss, didn't align with the nature of the wounds. According to Caldwell's official report, Johanna's skin was punctured in dozens of places, but these wounds were small and unlikely to cause fatal hemorrhaging. More puzzling still was the state of her eyes, which Caldwell described as clouded by a milky film, similar to what one might observe in certain poisonings. What disturbed Caldwell most, according to his private notes, was not just the condition of the body, but the behavior of Nathaniel Hargrove. Throughout the examination, Nathaniel remained in the corner of the bedroom, alternating between episodes of uncontrollable weeping and periods of eerie calm, during which he would stare at the bed with what Caldwell described as an expression of horrified recognition, as if seeing the culmination of something long expected. And when questioned directly about the insects, Nathaniel reportedly said only, "They've been in the walls for years." Johanna said they were waiting for something. I didn't believe her. God help me, I should have listened. The investigation that followed revealed several disquieting facts. First, the Hargrove house had long suffered from an infestation of what locals called tobacco beetles, pests that typically damaged drying tobacco leaves, but had apparently taken up residence within the walls of the house itself. Second, Johanna had been treating herself with various home remedies for what she described to the apothecary in Paris as a terrible sensation of crawling beneath the skin. The apothecary had sold her arsenic powders, ostensibly for the creation of a paste to eliminate the beetle infestation, but he admitted to the sheriff that Johanna had also inquired about the powder's medicinal applications. And finally, most disturbing of all, was the discovery made when authorities removed the mattress from the walnut bed. Carved into the underside of the headboard, in what experts later confirmed was Johanna's handwriting, was a passage in Latin that translated roughly to, "What sleeps between man and wife is neither man nor wife." The Latin phrase troubled those few educated men in the county who could translate it. The local schoolmaster, William Davenport, suggested that it might be a reference to an obscure theological text concerning the nature of marriage, but others saw in it something more sinister, an acknowledgment of some presence or entity that existed in the space between husband and wife, something that was neither, yet somehow existed. Beneath this inscription was another shorter phrase that defied immediate translation. Years later, a linguist from the University of Pennsylvania would identify it as a dialect of pre-Christian Ukrainian, roughly translating to, "The brood awakens in the marriage bed." Nathaniel Hargrove was briefly held on suspicion of murder, But with no clear evidence of foul play and the peculiar nature of Johanna's death, he was released after 3 days. The official cause was recorded as death by misadventure, possibly resulting from accidental poisoning and subsequent insect activity. During his brief incarceration, Nathaniel made several statements that the sheriff found concerning, enough to record but too bizarre to include in the official report. According to these notes, preserved in the county historical archives, Nathaniel claimed that he and Johanna had been changed by something in the house, that the insects had been speaking to Johanna for years through the walls, and had recently begun speaking to him as well. "They whisper things," Nathaniel reportedly said, "things no man should know, about what's inside us, about what we could become if we let them in. Johanna let them in. She thought she could control them, use them somehow. She was wrong." When asked to explain further, Nathaniel became agitated and refused to speak for several hours. When he finally resumed talking, he appeared more rational and denied making the previous statements, insisting that he had been overcome by grief and shock. But the people of Millbrook weren't satisfied with this explanation. Theories spread rapidly, some suggesting that Johanna had been slowly poisoning Nathaniel and accidentally ingested her own toxic preparation. Others insisting that the insects had been deliberately introduced into the bedding by Nathaniel as a form of prolonged torture. The most unsettling theory, whispered only behind closed doors, was that Johanna herself had invited the infestation as part of some arcane ritual learned from books that were later found hidden in a compartment beneath the floorboards of her dressing room. These books, written in languages that even the schoolteacher in Paris couldn't identify, were confiscated by the sheriff but disappeared from evidence before they could be properly examined. Some said Nathaniel burned them. Others claimed they were stolen by a collector of curiosities from Louisville who had heard about the bizarre case. One volume, however, found its way into the personal collection of Dr. Caldwell, who had a scholarly interest in ancient medical practices. This book, bound in dark leather with no title on its spine, contained handwritten notes in multiple languages, including what appeared to be family records and recipes for various preparations. Most disturbing were the detailed illustrations of human anatomy, interspersed with drawings of insects in various stages of development, suggesting some imagined or observed relationship between human physiology and insect life cycles. In the months following Johanna's death, Nathaniel Hargrove became increasingly reclusive. The tobacco farm fell into disrepair as the hired hands, unsettled by the rumors, found work elsewhere. Nathaniel was occasionally seen in Paris, purchasing large quantities of kerosene and arsenic powders, muttering about cleaning the house proper. He refused all visitors and reportedly slept in the barn, unwilling to enter the bedroom where his wife had died. Those who caught glimpses of Nathaniel during this period described alarming changes in his appearance. Once a robust man with a commanding presence, he had grown gaunt, his skin taking on a yellowish pallor. More unsettling were reports that he had developed a habit of constantly scratching at his arms and neck, leaving visible abrasions that he made no attempt to conceal. The postmaster, Willoughby, who still delivered mail to the farm twice weekly, reported that Nathaniel had begun covering all the mirrors in the house with cloth, a traditional practice following a death but unusual to maintain for months afterward. When Willoughby inquired about this, Nathaniel reportedly said, "It's not for her. It's so I don't have to see what's happening to me." On October 27, 1889, approximately 6 months after Johanna's death, smoke was spotted rising from the direction of the Hargrove farm. By the time neighbors arrived, the house was fully engulfed in flames. Nathaniel's body was later found in the master bedroom, or what remained of it, positioned on the charred frame of the walnut bed. The coroner determined that he had died of smoke inhalation, likely having fallen asleep after setting the fire himself. But here is where our story would typically end, a tragic tale of possible murder, definite suicide, and the destruction of a house that seemed, by all accounts, to have been corrupted by something unnatural. However, the historical record reveals a peculiar epilogue that transforms this from merely a tragic incident to something that continues to disturb researchers to this day. In December 1889, Ezekiel Preston, the neighbor who had first accompanied Nathaniel back to the death scene, began complaining of insomnia and a persistent sensation of movement beneath his skin. His wife reported that he would wake screaming, clawing at his arms and legs, insisting that something was burrowing into him. Dr. Caldwell prescribed sedatives and recommended warm baths with specific mineral salts, but Preston's condition deteriorated rapidly. What makes Preston's case particularly significant is that he kept a detailed journal of his experiences, believing that he was suffering from a physical ailment that medical science would eventually explain. This journal, preserved by his descendants and eventually donated to the County Historical Society, offers a day-by-day account of what Preston experienced, a rare contemporaneous record of what might otherwise be dismissed as delusion or hysteria. December 12, 1889. The crawling sensation began again last night, stronger than before. It starts at the extremities, fingertips, toes, and moves upward, as if something is traveling along the paths of my veins. Dr. Caldwell suggests it might be a nervous condition brought on by the shock of finding poor Johanna Hargrove in such a state. But this is no mere fancy of an overworked mind. I can feel them moving. A later entry is more specific, December 18, 1889. They are most active at night. I have taken to keeping a lamp burning, as they seem to retreat from the light. When I examine my skin in the morning, I find new marks, tiny holes like pinpricks, usually in clusters along my forearms and calves. Mary, Preston's wife, says she cannot see these marks, but they are clearly visible to me. I have used a magnifying glass to study them more closely. The edges are too precise for scratches or abrasions. They appear to be entry points. By late December, Preston's entries become increasingly disturbed, with references to hearing clicking sounds in the walls of his house and experiencing unusual dreams in which he encountered Johanna Hargrove, not as she had appeared in death, but transformed into something he could not fully describe. Her skin had become translucent, like the wing casings of certain beetles, and her movements were no longer human. She spoke to me, but her mouth did not move. The words seemed to form directly in my mind. The brood awakens. Boré Sarchurinto. On January 3, 1890, Preston was found dead in his bed, his body exhibiting the same peculiar small puncture wounds that had been observed on Johanna Hargrove. More disturbing still was the discovery that the Preston family had, some months earlier, purchased a bed frame at the estate sale held after Nathaniel's death, a walnut four-poster with carvings of tobacco leaves. The final entry in Preston's journal, dated January 2, 1890, reads simply, "They are no longer beneath my skin, they are my skin." While following Preston's death, the county authorities ordered the bed burned immediately, and Dr. Caldwell performed a more thorough autopsy than had been possible with Johanna Hargrove. His findings, documented in a report that was filed away and forgotten until a courthouse renovation in 1967 brought it to light, included the following observation. Upon examination of the subject's inner ear canal, I discovered what appears to be a colony of unusually small Coleoptera beetles, which seem to have established themselves within the subject's cranial cavity. Most alarmingly, several specimens extracted appear to be of a species unknown to my reference materials. The report included detailed sketches of the beetles, which entomologists who later examined the document suggested resembled a hybrid between common tobacco beetles and human parasites. This impossible hybridization led most experts to dismiss the findings as the product of a 19th century doctor's limited understanding of entomology. But Caldwell was no amateur. Before settling in the relative obscurity of Paris, Kentucky, he had studied at medical schools in Philadelphia and Vienna, where he had developed a particular interest in parasitology. His library, catalogued after his death, contained some of the most advanced texts available on insect anatomy and life cycle. If Caldwell identified something anomalous in the specimens he extracted from Preston's body, it was unlikely to be due to simple ignorance. More compelling still was Caldwell's private correspondence with a colleague at Johns Hopkins University, in which he described the specimens in greater detail. They bear superficial resemblance to Lacioderma sericorn, cigarette or tobacco beetle, but with significant anatomical differences, particularly in the structure of the mandibles, which appear adapted for penetrating mammalian tissue rather than feeding on dried plant matter. Most disturbing is the presence of what appear to be specialized sensory organs, unlike anything I have observed in conventional Coleoptera, organs that bear an unsettling resemblance to miniaturized human structures. But the story of what local historians now call the Millbrook bed death doesn't end with Preston. Between 1890 and 1892, 3 more deaths occurred in Bourbon County that shared the distinctive characteristics: small puncture wounds, a milky film over the eyes, and reports of victims experiencing the sensation of movement beneath their skin. In each case, the victim had some connection to either the Hargrove house or possessions that had been removed from it prior to the fire. The first victim was Meredith Sullivan, a 43-year-old furniture dealer from Paris who had purchased several items from the Hargrove estate sale. Sullivan died in February 1890, just weeks after acquiring a walnut side table that had reportedly been in the Hargrove bedroom. His widow described his deterioration as swift and horrifying, noting that in the days before his death, he had become convinced that insects were burrowing into his ears while he slept. Sullivan's death was officially attributed to brain fever, a catch-all diagnosis often applied to cases involving delirium and hallucinations. However, the undertaker who prepared his body later confided to Dr. Caldwell that he had discovered unusual cavities within Sullivan's ear canals and nasal passages, as if something had been nesting there. The second victim, Augusta Willoughby, wife of Postmaster Conrad, succumbed in July 1891 after developing symptoms remarkably similar to Johanna Hargrove's. What connected Augusta to the Hargrove case was a small wooden jewelry box that Conrad had salvaged from the roadside near the burnt remains of the Hargrove house, a gift for his wife that would prove fatal. According to Conrad's tortured account, published in the Paris newspaper, Augusta had begun complaining of strange dreams in which she saw Johanna Hargrove standing at the foot of their bed, whispering in a language Conrad couldn't understand. In these dreams, Conrad wrote, Johanna would open her mouth wider than any human mouth could possibly stretch, and from it would pour a stream of insects that flowed across the bed toward my sleeping wife. Augusta would wake screaming, clawing at her nightgown, insisting that she could feel them burrowing into her. I dismissed these as nightmares until I began to notice small wounds appearing on her skin, tiny, precise holes that did not bleed but seemed to pulsate slightly when examined closely. Augusta's condition deteriorated over several weeks, with symptoms progressing from insomnia and nightmares to physical weakness, and eventually a form of paralysis that Dr. Caldwell tentatively diagnosed as progressive neurological degradation of unknown origin. In her final days, she lost the ability to speak but would repeatedly draw the same image, a rough sketch of what appeared to be a beetle with distinctly human eyes. The third victim, whose identity remained somewhat mysterious in the historical record, was described only as an itinerant peddler found deceased in a boarding house in Lexington. What drew investigators' attention was the collection of small artifacts found among the peddler's possessions, items that matched descriptions of pieces known to have been in the Hargrove house including a carved wooden tobacco box bearing Nathaniel's initials. The boarding house keeper reported that the peddler had arrived in apparent good health, but began complaining of insect infestations in his room within days. When no insects were found, despite thorough searches, the peddler was assumed to be suffering from delirium tremens related to alcohol withdrawal. His body was discovered after other guests complained of a strange odor emanating from his room. The coroner who examined the body noted several unusual features, including the now familiar pattern of small puncture wounds and evidence of insect activity within body cavities. Most disturbing was his observation that the peddler's remains seemed to be unnaturally desiccated, as if vital fluids had been systematically extracted through the puncture sites. By 1895, the entire episode had passed into local legend, too disturbing to discuss openly, but too compelling to forget entirely. The site where the Hargrove house once stood remained vacant, the land deemed unsuitable for farming due to soil contamination from the fire. Locals avoided the area, claiming that tobacco planted near the old foundation grew twisted and harbored unusual insects that seemed impervious to normal pesticides. Mary Ann Caldwell, Dr. Caldwell's widow, became something of a local authority on the case, having assisted her husband in his investigations and preserved many of his notes after his own mysterious death in April 1890. According to accounts preserved in the County Historical Society, Mary Ann maintained that the Hargrove case represented something beyond ordinary medical understanding, a contagion that was neither bacterial nor viral, but something that existed at the intersection of the physical and the metaphysical. What killed these people? She was quoted as saying in an 1896 interview with a journalist from Louisville, was not merely an infestation of insects, but a transformation, as if something found a way to convert human tissue into another form entirely. My husband believed in his final days that whatever began in the Hargrove bed had found a way to move from host to host, using the beetles as merely one stage in its life cycle. When pressed for more details, Mary Ann reportedly became reticent, stating only that her husband had left explicit instructions for the handling of his own remains, complete cremation, and the destruction of any materials that might have been contaminated. Vernon believed, she concluded, that the contagion could persist in wood, particularly in the walnut from which that dreadful bed was crafted. Dr. Caldwell's death itself remains something of a mystery. According to the official record, he died of fever of unknown origin after a brief illness. However, Mary Ann later confided to close friends that her husband had begun experiencing the same symptoms as the Hargrove case victims: insomnia, the sensation of movement beneath the skin, and eventually the appearance of small puncture wounds that he documented meticulously in his personal journal. This journal, which Mary Ann claimed to have burned according to her husband's wishes, supposedly contained detailed observations of his own symptoms, along with speculations about the nature of the contagion. According to those who claimed to have seen portions of it before its destruction, Caldwell had come to believe that the insects were not merely parasites, but vessels for something older and more intelligent, a form of consciousness that existed before human civilization and had found in the intimate space of the marriage bed an ideal environment for propagation. In 1912, a professor of folklore from the University of Kentucky visited Bourbon County to collect stories about the incident as part of a broader study on Appalachian superstitions. His notes, preserved in the university archives, include interviews with aging residents who remembered the Hargroves. One account, provided by a woman who had worked as a laundress for several county families, offers a particularly chilling detail previously unrecorded. "Mrs. Hargrove once told me something strange," the laundress recalled. "She said that every night she would hear Mr. Nathaniel grinding his teeth in his sleep. Said it was a terrible sound, like beetles chewing through wood. But she also said, and here's the peculiar part, She said that on the nights when she heard that sound, she would wake in the morning to find Nathaniel watching her, wide awake, claiming that it was her teeth he had heard, grinding all night. The professor's notes include his own observation. There appears to be a curious inversion in how husband and wife experienced their nights together, each believing the other was the source of the unsettling sounds. This suggests a phenomenon psychologists might term shared delusion, though the subsequent physical evidence makes such an explanation insufficient. Another intriguing account came from Theodore Holcomb, who had been a young farmhand on a neighboring property in 1889. According to Holcomb, Nathaniel Hargrove had undergone a marked change in personality in the year leading up to Johanna's death. He was always a stern man, Holcomb recounted, but there came a time when he seemed hollow somehow, like something had been scooped out of him and replaced with something else. His eyes got dull, and sometimes, when he spoke, it was as if the words were coming from somewhere other than his mouth. Holcomb further claimed that Nathaniel had developed an unusual habit of collecting dead insects, particularly beetles, which he would place in glass jars in his tobacco barn. I once asked him why he kept them, Holcomb told the professor. He just looked at me with those empty eyes and said, "They're not dead, boy. They're waiting." What makes Holcomb's testimony particularly valuable is that, unlike many who provided accounts decades after the events, he had kept a daily work journal during his employment near the Hargrove farm. This journal, which he shared with the folklore professor, contained contemporaneous observations of the changes in Nathaniel's behavior and appearance in the months leading up to Johanna's death. One entry, dated October 1888, reads, "Hargrove came by today to borrow father's saw. Noticed strange marks on his hands and wrists, small red dots in perfect circles. When I asked if he'd been injured, he pulled his sleeves down and said it was just a rash from handling tobacco. But the pattern was too regular for any rash I've ever seen." A later entry from February 1889 describes an unsettling encounter. "Saw Hargrove standing at the edge of our property before dawn, just standing there, perfectly still, staring at our house. Father called out to him, but he didn't respond. When we approached, he seemed to snap out of some trance and claimed he was looking for a stray dog. His eyes looked strange, the pupils so wide you could hardly see the color around them, and there was a smell about him like turned earth and something rotting underneath it." The professor's study was never published in its entirety, with only excerpts appearing in academic journals focused on folklore and regional history. In a letter to his department chair, the professor explained his reluctance to publish the complete findings. "While I began this research expecting to document typical rural superstitions, what I encountered in Bourbon County appears to be something more substantive, a case where the line between folklore and medical mystery becomes indistinguishable. I fear that publishing the full accounts might sensationalize what should properly be the subject of more serious scientific inquiry." Between 1920 and 1950, the Millbrook bed death case faded into obscurity, relegated to local folklore and occasional mentions in collections of Kentucky ghost stories. The scientific community, increasingly focused on evidence-based approaches to medicine and entomology, had little interest in a rural mystery with supernatural overtones. World War I, the Great Depression, and then World War II directed attention to more immediate concerns. But in 1924, an incident occurred that briefly revived interest in the case among a small circle of researchers interested in unusual phenomena. A furniture restorer in Cincinnati purchased an antique walnut headboard at an estate sale in northern Kentucky. According to a newspaper account published in the Cincinnati Enquirer, the restorer discovered unusual markings carved into the underside of the piece. Photos accompanying the article show what appears to be Latin text, matching the inscription reportedly found on the Hargrove bed. The restorer, described as a man of scientific curiosity, placed the headboard in his workshop for further examination. 3 weeks later, he was found dead in his bed, his body exhibiting the now familiar pattern of small puncture wounds. Most disturbingly, the autopsy revealed evidence of insect activity within his ear canals and nasal passages, with several specimens collected and preserved in alcohol. These specimens were sent to the entomology department at Ohio State University, where they were studied briefly before being transferred to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. According to correspondence between the institutions, the specimens represented an anomalous hybrid species with characteristics of both Lasioderma sericorn, tobacco beetle, and certain human ectoparasites. The official designation was specimen of unknown origin, possibly manufactured taxidermy curiosities. The specimens themselves were apparently lost during a reorganization of the Smithsonian's entomological collection in the 1960s, and no photographs or detailed descriptions survive beyond the initial correspondence. What happened to the headboard after the restorer's death remains undocumented. Some accounts suggest it was destroyed by his widow, while others claim it was sold to a private collector fascinated by its macabre history. Either way, it disappeared from the historical record, along with any definitive explanation for the deaths associated with it. Between 1925 and 1950, references to the Millbrook bed death case became increasingly scarce in public records. World wars, economic depression, and the rapid modernization of American society pushed such regional mysteries to the margins of historical interest. But within certain academic and medical circles, the case maintained a quiet notoriety. In 1937, a researcher at Johns Hopkins University published a paper in an obscure medical journal examining historical cases of collective psychogenic illness in rural communities. While the researcher did not mention the Hargrove case by name, his description of a peculiar series of deaths in a Kentucky farming community, characterized by delusions of parasitosis and unusual post-mortem findings, clearly referenced the incidents in Bourbon County. The paper proposed that the deaths might have been caused by ergot poisoning, a fungal contamination of grain that can cause hallucinations and the sensation of insects crawling beneath the skin, combined with mass hysteria and possibly deliberate poisoning in some cases. However, this explanation failed to account for the physical evidence of insect activity documented in the autopsy reports. During the Second World War, when research into biological weapons and chemical warfare intensified, the Hargrove case briefly attracted the attention of military scientists. A classified memo dated June 1943, declassified in the 1990s under the Freedom of Information Act, makes reference to the Kentucky beetle incident as a potential model for vector-borne contagions with psychological components. The memo suggests that whatever affected the victims in Bourbon County represented a unique combination of psychological and physiological vectors, potentially offering insights into advanced bioweapon development. The document concludes with a recommendation to locate and secure any surviving specimens or artifacts connected to the case, though no record exists of whether this recommendation was acted upon. In 1968, a historian named Margaret Wainwright attempted to locate the exact site of the Hargrove farm as part of a comprehensive survey of historic properties in Bourbon County. According to her field notes, preserved in the County Historical Society archives, she identified a clearing that matched the description from contemporary accounts, including the remains of a stone foundation that could have supported a house of the size described. Wainwright's notes include a curious observation. The site appears to be completely devoid of insect life, despite the surrounding forest teeming with typical species. Local guide suggests that nothing has lived on this patch of ground since the fire of 1889. Her final entry, dated June 12, 1968, indicates her intention to return the following day with photographic equipment. No further entries appear in her journal, and according to county records, Wainwright abandoned her survey shortly thereafter, citing health concerns in her letter of resignation. Her colleagues reported that she had developed an intense phobia of insects and could not tolerate even the sound of buzzing flies. What became of Margaret Wainwright after her resignation remains a subject of speculation among those familiar with the Hargrove case. According to some accounts, she relocated to Arizona, explaining that the dry desert climate was better for her health. Others claim she was institutionalized briefly at a facility in Lexington where she was treated for severe entomophobia and paranoid delusions involving insects burrowing beneath her skin. In 1972, a graduate student in history at the University of Kentucky attempted to locate Wainwright for an oral history project focused on women in historical research. The student's notes indicate that Wainwright refused the interview, sending back a brief, handwritten response. "I no longer discuss my work in Kentucky. Some fields of inquiry are best left fallow," the student persisted, traveling to Tucson, where Wainwright had supposedly relocated. What she found, according to her thesis advisor's recollection, was a woman dramatically changed from the methodical historian described in professional references. Emaciated, paranoid, her arms and legs covered with small, self-inflicted wounds that she insisted were breathing holes necessary to let them out when they're ready. The student abandoned her attempt to interview Wainwright and returned to Kentucky visibly shaken by the encounter. She changed the focus of her thesis and reportedly refused to discuss Wainwright or the Hargrove case with colleagues. When asked years later about the experience, she would say only that some stories don't want to be told. In the 1980s, the case attracted the attention of Dr. Eleanor Sullivan, an entomologist specializing in rare beetle species at Cornell University. Sullivan had encountered references to the anomalous hybrid species in the archived correspondence between Ohio State University and the Smithsonian, and became intrigued by the possibility of an undocumented beetle variant that could parasitize humans. Sullivan's initial inquiries met with institutional resistance. The Smithsonian denied any knowledge of the specimens, and Ohio State claimed that the relevant records had been destroyed in a small fire in the entomology department in the 1950s. Undeterred, Sullivan began tracking down descendants of the original witnesses and victims, hoping to find any artifacts or specimens that might have been preserved privately. Her search led her to James Caldwell, great-grandson of Dr. Vernon Caldwell, who had inherited a collection of his ancestors' personal effects, including medical instruments, books, and a small wooden case containing what appeared to be insect specimens, preserved in amber-colored resin. These specimens, which Sullivan was permitted to examine but not remove from Caldwell's possession, exhibited unusual characteristics that she documented in detailed sketches and notes. According to Sullivan's observations, the preserved insects resembled tobacco beetles in general morphology, but with significant anomalies, including modified mandibles that appeared designed for penetrating flesh rather than plant material, and sensory structures unlike those found in any known beetle species. Most disturbing was Sullivan's observation that several specimens appeared to contain integrated human tissue, not merely as undigested food or foreign material within the digestive tract, but as apparently functional components of the insect's anatomy. In one specimen, what seemed to be human nerve tissue had been incorporated into the insect's ganglia. In another, structures resembling miniaturized human sensory organs were visible within the head capsule. Sullivan prepared a paper documenting these findings, intending to submit it to a prominent entomological journal. However, before the paper could be published, she experienced a home invasion in which her research materials were stolen, including all photographs and sketches of the specimens. James Caldwell reported a similar break-in, during which the wooden case containing his great-grandfather's specimens was the only item taken. Following these incidents, Sullivan abandoned her research into the Hargrove case, citing concerns for her personal safety. In a private letter to a colleague, she expressed her belief that certain parties with governmental connections were actively suppressing information about the case and its implications. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Millbrook bed death is not what we know, but what remains undiscovered. The Latin inscription found on the bed, "What sleeps between man and wife is neither man nor wife," suggests a presence, an entity or force that existed in the space between Nathaniel and Johanna Hargrove. Whether this was a physical infestation, a psychological contagion, or something that defies conventional categorization, the evidence suggests it did not die with its original hosts. The most recent connection to the case emerged in 2003 when a graduate student in anthropology was conducting research on folk remedies used in 19th century Kentucky. Among the material she examined was a collection of correspondence between Dr. Vernon Caldwell and a colleague at Johns Hopkins University. In one letter, dated March 1890, Caldwell makes a reference that had been previously overlooked by researchers. "The beetle specimens I sent you are but one facet of this strange case, Wam," Caldwell wrote. "I have become convinced that what afflicted the Hargrove household was not merely an infestation, but a transformation. The insects recovered from the subsequent victims appear to contain trace elements of human tissue incorporated into their exoskeletons, an impossibility by any scientific understanding, yet observable under microscopic examination." The letter continues with a disturbing hypothesis. "I fear what we are witnessing is not parasitism in the conventional sense, but a conversion of human tissue into insect form, a colonization at the cellular level that allows the host to remain ambulatory and seemingly normal until the conversion reaches a critical threshold. Most disturbingly, this process appears to be communicable through prolonged contact with infected materials, particularly the wood of that accursed bed, which I have come to believe serves as a reservoir for the contagion." Caldwell's letter concludes with a personal note. "I write this with some urgency, as I have recently discovered a small lesion on my own wrist that exhibits the characteristic appearance of the initial infection. I have excised the affected tissue and will forward it to you separately. Should my suspicions prove correct, and should I begin to experience the symptoms reported by the victims, I beg you to ensure that my remains are completely cremated and any possessions I have contacted destroyed." No response from Caldwell's colleague has been found, nor is there any record of his having submitted tissue samples as mentioned. However, county death records confirm that Dr. Vernon Caldwell died on April 30th, 1890, with the cause listed simply as fever of unknown origin. According to the funeral home ledger, his body was cremated at the specific request of his widow, who also insisted that his medical books and instruments be burned rather than sold or donated. In the decades following Caldwell's death, several other physicians and researchers who examined materials related to the case reportedly experienced similar symptoms: skin lesions, insomnia, and the sensation of movement beneath the skin. Most notorious was the case of Dr. Elias Montgomery, a pathologist at the University of Louisville Medical School, who in 1918 obtained permission to exhume the remains of one of the victims, likely Augusta Willoughby, for a study on parasitic infestations. According to an account published in a medical journal in 1919, Montgomery's assistants found him in his laboratory one morning, frantically cutting into his own forearm with a scalpel. When restrained, Montgomery reportedly insisted that he could see them moving beneath the skin and begged his colleagues to get them out before they reached the bone. Montgomery was institutionalized at the Eastern Kentucky Asylum for the Insane, later renamed Eastern State Hospital, in Lexington, where he died 3 weeks later. The official cause of death was listed as septicemia, resulting from self-inflicted wounds, but asylum records indicate that during autopsy, the examining physician discovered unusual cavities within the long bones, apparently hollowed from within, containing unidentified insect larvae. The asylum physician's report was suppressed by the medical school administration, and Montgomery's research materials were reportedly destroyed in a small laboratory fire of suspicious origin. His published works were quietly withdrawn from the medical school library, and references to his research were expunged from departmental records, actions that suggest a deliberate attempt to distance the institution from his disturbing findings. The final piece of this disturbing historical puzzle comes not from Kentucky, but from the National Archives in Washington, D.C. In a classified file declassified in 2001, there is a brief mention of an incident in 1952 when a military entomologist was called to examine unusual insect specimens recovered from a private collection in Louisville that had been donated to the state university. The entomologist's report describes beetle-like organisms with unprecedented anatomical features, including structures resembling human dental tissue integrated into their mandibles. The report further notes that several laboratory assistants who handled the specimens developed skin lesions and reported sensations of movement beneath their skin. The file indicates that the entire collection was subsequently confiscated by federal authorities and transported to an unnamed research facility. The file ends with a recommendation. Specimens appear to represent a previously undocumented form of parasitic organism with concerning implications for public health. Recommend complete isolation and restricted access. Connection to historical incidents in Bourbon County, 1889 to 1890, should be further investigated, but kept strictly confidential to prevent public concern. No further documents related to this investigation have been declassified, leaving us to wonder what became of these specimens and what conclusions, if any, were reached about their origin and nature. In the 1970s and 1980s, the Millbrook bed death case faded further from public knowledge, preserved primarily in academic archives, and the private collections of researchers interested in unusual medical phenomena. Occasionally, articles would appear in paranormal magazines or obscure journals, typically rehashing known details without adding new insights. But in 1992, a curious development brought the case back to the attention of a select group of researchers. A fire at a private residence in Frankfort, Kentucky, revealed a hidden compartment within a wall that contained a small wooden box with brass fittings. Inside the box was a journal, partially damaged by heat and water, identified as belonging to Johanna Hargrove. The journal, written primarily in a mixture of English and what experts identified as an obscure dialect of Ukrainian, contained entries dating from 1875 to 1889. While much of the content was mundane, accounts of daily life on the tobacco farm, observations about weather conditions, and recipes for various household preparations, certain passages stood out for their disturbing implications. In an entry dated October 12, 1887, Johanna wrote, "The sounds within the walls have increased. N insists it is merely the house settling, but I know better. They are gathering, preparing. I have begun the preparations as instructed in grandmother's book, but fear I may be too late. The bed is already marked." A later entry, dated January 3, 1889, is even more concerning. "They speak to me now, not in words, but in sensations, 1,000 tiny legs moving across my thoughts. N does not hear them, but his body knows. I see the small holes appearing on his back when he bathes, though he cannot see them himself. The transformation has begun in him too. Soon we will be ready for the conjunction." The final entry, dated April 15, 1889, one day before Johanna's death, consists of a single sentence. "What sleeps between man and wife waits no longer." The journal was reportedly acquired by a private collector with connections to occult research circles, and its current whereabouts are unknown. Photocopies of several pages circulated briefly among academics interested in the case, but the authenticity of the document was never conclusively established. Some scholars dismissed it as an elaborate hoax, while others found in it compelling evidence that whatever happened in the Hargrove household had roots in practices or knowledge that Johanna had brought with her from Europe. Additional pages from the journal, which surfaced in 2008 in an online auction of historical curiosities, contained what appeared to be detailed instructions for a ritual described as the awakening of the brood. These instructions included precise measurements for the construction of a bed, specifications for the type of wood to be used, walnut being most receptive to the influence, and a series of incantations in what linguists identified as a pre-Christian Slavic dialect associated with certain fertility cults in the Carpathian region. Most disturbing was a passage that seemed to describe the purpose of the ritual. Through the conjunction of man and wife, a third presence may be invited, neither man nor wife, but partaking of both. This presence, once awakened, will transform the flesh of the hosts, creating a new form that bridges the divide between the human and the insectile. The brood, once established, will spread through wood and flesh alike, each generation carrying forward the consciousness of those consumed. The authenticity of these additional pages is even more questionable than the original journal, with several experts in historical documents suggesting they may be sophisticated forgeries created to capitalize on renewed interest in the case. However, certain details in the ritual instructions, particularly the specific anatomical changes described as occurring in the vessels, presumably the human hosts, align with medical observations recorded by Dr. Caldwell that were not widely known outside academic circles. In 2010, an anonymous donor provided funding to the University of Kentucky for a research project focused on unusual parasitic relationships in historical context, with specific reference to the Bourbon County incidents. The project was to include DNA analysis of any surviving specimens and a comprehensive review of all documentation related to the case. However, before the project could begin in earnest, the lead researcher, Dr. Helena Torres, withdrew her participation, citing personal concerns about the ethical implications of the work. In a brief statement to colleagues, Torres explained that she had experienced unsettling dreams after reviewing the preliminary materials and felt that some areas of research carry inherent risks that cannot be mitigated by standard laboratory protocols. The project was subsequently canceled, and the funding redirected to more conventional studies of parasitic insects affecting agricultural products, a decision that some saw as evidence of institutional discomfort with the implications of the Hargrove case. In private correspondence that was later leaked to researchers interested in the case, Torres described her dreams in more detail. "I found myself in a dimly lit room with a large bed at its center. On the bed lay two figures, a man and a woman, but their bodies were changing. Their skin had a translucent quality, and beneath it I could see movement, thousands of tiny forms shifting and reorganizing the tissue. The most disturbing aspect was that both figures were conscious and appeared to be in a state of ecstasy rather than agony. When they saw me watching, they spoke in unison. The space between is where the transformation begins. I woke with a sensation of movement beneath my own skin, which persisted for several hours." Torres reportedly destroyed all materials related to the project that were in her possession and refused all further contact with researchers interested in the Hargrove case. She resigned from her position at the university the following year and, according to former colleagues, relocated to New Zealand, where she abandoned entomology entirely in favor of marine biology, a field as far removed from the study of insects as possible while still remaining within the biological sciences. Local historians in Bourbon County are understandably reluctant to discuss the case, preferring to focus on the region's more marketable heritage of bourbon production and horse breeding. The exact location of the Hargrove Farm has been deliberately obscured in modern records, and attempts by paranormal investigators to access the site have been consistently blocked by landowners who cite concerns about trespassing and liability. But the story persists in local memory, passed down through generations as a cautionary tale, not just about the dangers of the unknown, but about the spaces that exist between people who share the most intimate proximity. What sleeps between man and wife? In most homes, nothing more than trust and the vulnerability of unconsciousness. But in that bed in Millbrook, Kentucky, something else found room to grow, to feed, and perhaps to evolve into a form that continues to seek new hosts to this day. In recent years, several cases have been documented in medical journals describing a condition termed delusional parasitosis, a psychiatric disorder in which individuals become convinced that they are infested with parasites, insects, or bugs, despite no objective evidence of an infestation. Sufferers typically report sensations of crawling, biting, or burrowing beneath the skin, and often self-inflict wounds in attempts to extract the imagined parasites. While modern medicine classifies this as a form of psychosis, some researchers have noted similarities between these contemporary cases and the historical accounts from Bourbon County. The key difference, of course, is that in the Millbrook case, physical evidence of unusual insect activity was documented by multiple credible witnesses, including medical professionals with no apparent connection to the initial incidents. This raises a disturbing possibility. What if some cases diagnosed as delusional parasitosis represent genuine encounters with something that conventional medicine is not equipped to recognize or treat? What if the sensation of movement beneath the skin is not always a delusion, but sometimes the first symptom of a transformation that medical science has no framework to understand? Dr. Marcus Reynolds, a parasitologist at the Centers for Disease Control, published a controversial paper in 2015 suggesting that certain cases diagnosed as delusional parasitosis might actually represent novel host-parasite relationships that current diagnostic tools fail to detect. Reynolds pointed to historical precedents where conditions initially dismissed as psychosomatic were later found to have biological causes, such as the link between Helicobacter pylori and ulcers, which was rejected by the medical establishment for years before becoming accepted science. The history of medicine is littered with examples of legitimate physical conditions that were initially attributed to psychological causes, Reynolds wrote. We would be remiss not to consider the possibility that at least some cases of what we currently call delusional parasitosis might involve actual parasitic organisms that operate at scales or in ways that elude conventional detection methods. Reynolds specifically cited the Bourbon County incidents as a historical case where physical evidence suggested a genuine parasitic relationship, despite the tendency of modern researchers to dismiss the accounts as a combination of hysteria, poisoning, and primitive medical understanding. In 2018, a researcher at the Centers for Disease Control submitted a request for any records relating to anomalous insect specimens collected in Kentucky between 1889 and 1960. The request was prompted by a cluster of unusual cases in rural Tennessee, where several individuals reported symptoms remarkably similar to those described in the Hargrove case: sensations of movement beneath the skin, small puncture wounds appearing overnight, and in 2 cases, evidence of insect activity within body cavities that should have been inaccessible to conventional parasites. The CDC's investigation concluded that the Tennessee cases represented a previously unidentified form of myiasis, infestation of the body by the larvae of flies, combined with possible exposure to environmental toxins that produced neurological symptoms. But internal documents obtained through another Freedom of Information Act request suggests that some investigators were troubled by inconsistencies in this explanation, particularly the fact that the specimens recovered did not match any known species of fly larvae and appeared to incorporate elements of human tissue in their structures. One internal memo written by a senior entomologist notes, "While we are classifying this as an unusual form of myiasis for public consumption, the specimens exhibit characteristics that defy conventional taxonomy. The resemblance to historical specimens described in the Kentucky cases, 1889-1890, is concerning and warrants further controlled study in maximum containment facilities." The memo concludes with a recommendation that is both practical and chilling. Given the apparent ability of these organisms to transfer from host to host via physical objects, particularly wooden furniture, affected households should be advised to destroy, not merely discard, all wooden furnishings, especially beds and bedroom furniture. The story of the Millbrook bed death and its potential modern manifestations serves as a reminder of the limitations of our understanding, both scientific and psychological. We live in an age where most mysteries seem solvable through the application of rigorous methodology and advanced technology. Yet cases like this suggest there may be phenomena that exist at the boundaries of our conceptual frameworks, defying neat categorization as either physical disease or psychological disorder. What if, as Dr. Caldwell suggested in his correspondence, the boundary between human and insect is not as impermeable as we believe? What if, under certain conditions, a form of transformation can occur that is neither fully natural nor supernatural, but represents an alternative biological pathway that our science has yet to recognize, and perhaps most disturbing of all? What if the intimate space between two people sharing a bed, that vulnerable moment when consciousness fades and bodies lie defenseless, provides the perfect environment for something else to flourish, something that is neither man nor wife, but a third presence that waits, watches, and when conditions are right, begins the slow process of transformation? Sleep well tonight, and perhaps check beneath your mattress before you do. After all, the most terrifying possibility is not that such a contagion might exist, but that it might have already found its way into your home, waiting for the moment when consciousness fades and the body lies defenseless against invasion. And if you happen to wake in the night to the sound of grinding, like beetles chewing through wood, or perhaps teeth gnashing in distress, remember the words carved into that walnut headboard: "What sleeps between man and wife is neither man nor wife." It may already be too late,